Hello, my good friends. Welcome back to another study with me. Today, we are looking at What Works? Gender Equality by Design by Iris Bohnett, and in particular, Chapter 12, Shaping Norms. In 2011, the UK Behavioural Insights team sent more than 100,000 letters to British citizens reminding them that they had not yet paid their taxes. Often dubbed the Nudge Unit, the Behavioural Insights team was created in 2010 at number 10 Downing Street to use behavioural insights to improve how government works. The letters sent were identical but for one short paragraph, the difference sometimes consisting of one sentence only. A first group of recipients read that 9 out of 10 people pay their taxes on time. A second group received a slightly amended version of this sentence. 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay their taxes on time. And a third group saw the following two sentences. 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay their taxes on time. You are currently in the very small minority of people who have not paid us yet. Others either received no additional message or an altogether different one that reminded them that paying taxes was important for the provision of public services. The third letter was the winner. It generated tax revenue of more than $3 million in less than a month. The team was intrigued and ran more experiments, all confirming that messages that have the most impact tell readers about what others do and point out that you are the outlier. Sharing such information establishes social norms. Generally, people want to run with the herd. Dozens of field experiments similar to the one described above establish this fact. Contrary to traditional economic theory, people do not vote when nobody else is voting. Think about this. In a rational world, we would expect people to be especially interested in voting as the odds increase that their vote would prove decisive. But this is not how it works. People copy others. They are more likely to vote when voter turnout is high and stay home when it is not. Similarly, people are more likely to lower their energy use, donate money in support of public radio, or recycle when informed that most people are also doing these things. People are conditionally cooperative and are more likely to contribute to public goods when others do so as well. People are even more likely to accept a job offer when informed that most others have done so in the past. In a field experiment involving thousands of recent college graduates who were accepted to teach in an underperforming school in the Teach for America program, the admitted were more likely to say yes when the offer letter mentioned the high fraction of people who had accepted the offer in the previous year. They were also more likely to follow through on their acceptance and still be working in the job half a year later. These studies suggest that we can turn descriptive norms, what many people are already doing, into prescriptive norms just by telling people about them. What is becomes what should be. People are generally more likely to adopt a behaviour if they know that most others are already doing it. We sometimes refer to this as herding behaviour. The behaviour of others, the herd, informs us as to what is normal, appropriate, or beneficial to do. And we then do likewise. An early powerful demonstration of this was run in a parking lot. The researchers put flyers on people's windshields as well as on the ground. They were interested in learning what fraction of the people finding a flyer on their car windows would toss it on the floor as opposed to either keeping it or disposing of it properly. As you would expect, people were much more likely to throw their flyer on the ground if the parking lot was already littered. Robert Cialdini, one of the authors of this study, went on to explore the impact of such norms in many different contexts. One of the more troubling findings is that people also do more bad things if others do them as well. In one study, he and collaborators wished to find out how to discourage visitors to Arizona's Petrified Forest National Park from removing the petrified wood. They found that posting signs emphasizing that many others had stolen some made people more likely to do the same. In spring of 2013, I shared these insights with the UK Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, then led by Secretary Vince Cable. The team I met with worked on increasing gender diversity on corporate boards in the United Kingdom without reliance on quotas. They were inspired by some of the work of the Behavioural Insights team and eager to apply some of their findings to gender. They were also in a hurry as they were trying to help companies follow through on the goals set in the so-called Davies Report, written by Lord Davies of Abersoch. Following an independent review into the number of women on corporate boards launched in February of 2011, Lord Davies recommended that UK-listed companies in the FTSE 100 set a minimum target for 25% female board member representation by 2015. Lord Davies said, over the past 25 years, the number of women in full-time employment has increased by more than a third, and there have been many steps towards gender equality in the workplace with flexible working and the Equal Pay Act. However, there is still a long way to go. Currently, 18 FTSE 100 companies have no female directors at all, and nearly half of all FTSE 250 companies do not have a woman in the boardroom. Radical change is needed in the mindset of the business community if we are to implement the scale of change that is needed. Similarly, Theresa May, then Home Secretary and Minister for Women and Equality, commented, "Women make up more than half of the population, but account for just 12.5% of the FTSE 100 directors." Lord Davies' report is an important step forward in understanding why this is and what can be done about it, and I shall be considering his findings very carefully. The illustration on the cover of the report graphically made this point. But what is this smart messaging? Based on insights about the relevance of norms in other domains made by the director of the Behavioural Insights team, David Halpern, I was sceptical. Was it really smart to focus on the small minority that women represented? Couldn't this data point become self-fulfilling, suggesting that this state of affairs is the norm? After all, when it comes to gender, we are up against views that are more likely strongly held than those about littering, voting, or tax collection. In an analysis of attitudes espoused in the World Values Surveys of 1990, 1995, and 1999, for example, Nicole Fortin found that across 25 OECD countries, women were less likely to be employed outside of the home in countries where a majority agreed with the statement, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. Around the world, perceptions of men as breadwinners and women as homemakers still matter a lot. I suggested the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills run a field experiment to evaluate the effectiveness of these communication strategies. Maybe they worked just fine. Perhaps norms did not play the same role in the gender domain as they did in other domains, and focusing on the fact that most companies and most countries had very few women leaders did not hurt the cause. Or, alternatively, perhaps there was something useful to be learned about encouraging gender diversity. What if, instead of describing the small fraction of female corporate directors, messages focused on the large fraction of companies with gender-diverse boards? In fact, I brought an image created by Kerry Connolly of the Women in Public Policy program to the meeting to illustrate what it could look like. The department never ran the study. My suggestion was crowded out by other felt imperatives. I did note, however, that in 2013, Secretary Cable no longer focused on the small share of women on boards, but instead said, today, 94 of the FTSE 100 companies count women on their boards, as do over 2/3 of all FTSE 350 companies. By the end of 2015, the FTSE 100 companies had more than 25% female directors on their boards. A success story? Mostly. The best answer is an enthusiastic yes with a little caveat. The achievement certainly is a huge success. After years of very little movement, the United Kingdom was able to more than double the fraction of women on its corporate boards, all without coercion. Much work went into making this happen by the government, the private sector, and by non-governmental organisations such as the 30% Club, devoted to increasing the fraction of female directors on FTSE 100 boards to 30%. The caveat relates to what was learned in the process. Unfortunately, the department never ran a controlled trial, so we will never know what the impact of the reframed communication was. Did focusing people's attention on the new norm of having gender diverse boards matter, or was Britain's big step forward attributed to some of the many additional interventions used? While we will never quite know, my colleagues and I could not let the question rest without some sort of a research-based answer. Short of a field experiment, we brought the question to the lab and were shocked by what we found. We had a first set of student subjects play the role of employer and asked them to hire a team of 5 people for a math and a verbal task. We chose these tasks, stereotypically associated with men and women, on purpose, as we wanted to see whether a norm nudge could correct stereotypical behaviour. This first set of employers was the norm creator. We ran various sessions and then informed a second set of employers of what experimental participants in a previous session had done. It turns out that when this new set of employers had no information on what choices others had made, male employers tended to choose slightly stereotypically, with about 60% choosing majority male teams for the math task and majority female teams for the verbal task. Female employers went with a 50-50 split on both tasks on average. When we informed them about a session where most employers had chosen majority female teams for both math and verbal tasks, men reacted by choosing fewer women. Under that condition, about 70% chose majority male teams in both the math and the verbal tasks. The nudge had moved them in the wrong direction and cost women 10 percentage points in the math task and 30 percentage points in the verbal task. In contrast, when we informed male employers about a session where most employers had chosen majority male teams, not much happened. Neither did anything happen for female employers. On average, women pretty much chose male and female employees equally, independent of the information provided. Such male defense of the status quo is not unprecedented. After all, we're in a zero-sum world. Increasing the fraction of one gender in a team means decreasing the share of the other gender, unless one can make the team bigger. Deutsche Telekom was one of the first large companies and the first DAX 30 company to introduce a gender quota for its middle and senior management. On March 15th of 2010, it announced that by the end of 2015, it wanted to have 30% women in its middle and senior ranks. As has happened in other companies with gender diversity goals, many men were not excited about this prospect. They saw, quite literally, their slice of the middle and upper management pie shrinking in front of their eyes. German journalists wrote about discrimination of men, the battle of the sexes, and asked where to put the men. Thus, male resistance to interventions favouring women is real, whether in the laboratory, in corporate offices, and maybe even in boardrooms. Aaron Deere, in his 2015 book Challenging Boardroom Homogeneity, argues that gender diversity norms, while often espoused in theory, have not become a reality in most boardrooms yet. He is more optimistic about the United Kingdom. The UK government appears to have been able to play the role of a norm entrepreneur, a term coined by Cass Sunstein in 1996. Without relying on legally mandated gender representation on boards, it has been able to move the needle. Norm entrepreneurs build on latently available notions of right and wrong, even if people treat such notions more as theoretical concerns rather than guidelines determining their actions. Deere believes that the United States could be a fertile ground for norm entrepreneurship around diversity. He reports on the many businesses that supported the US Supreme Court's 2003 decision to uphold the University of Michigan Law School's affirmative action policy in Gruder v. Bollinger. The firms filed an amicus curiae brief arguing that American businesses needed to have access to a diverse talent pool to compete in an increasingly global world with ever-growing diversity. A few years later, many of the same firms submitted another brief in Fisher v. University of Texas at Austin, basically repeating their earlier arguments and stating that the case for diversity had become even more compelling. Norm entrepreneurship can help these organizations embrace diversity not just as a principle, but also as a practice. Invoking what others do appears to be more likely to work at resetting norms that less people perceive the consequences as zero-sum. Organizations need to find ways to increase the pie, for example, by increasing the size of executive committees or boards, an approach that many Norwegian companies opted for when they had to comply with the quota of having 40% female directors. The fixed pie mentality is a well-known barrier to creative problem solving. How people see competition matters. If people perceive that every additional person joining the labour force as a threat, they'll be less welcoming of new entrants, including women. Inner analysis of the relationship between people's attitudes and women's workforce participation, Fortin finds that in countries where men had a more favourable view of competition, women's employment rates were higher. Nevertheless, some constraints are real and choices have to be made. Men who have been standing in line for the next top job will not be excited about additional competition from women. That this is so should strike us as neither surprising nor new. Those who benefit from existing practices and norms generally do not cheer when barriers to entry for new competitors are lowered. Monopolies and cartels rarely go quietly. But ignoring those concerns can backfire, as the research on intergroup threats suggests. In the worst case, increasing women's economic independence has led to a surge in domestic violence, evidence from Bangladesh and India suggests. Thus, when changing norms, taking both winners and losers into account is the prudent and the pragmatic approach. One such approach is reaping the benefits that can come from people comparing themselves with others. This means copying others, yes, but it also implies competing with others. Take O-Power, a company based in the United States, as an example. I have immediate experience with their intervention, being the recipient and the beneficiary of it. O-Power has our utility company, National Grid, sent our household a personalised home energy report that compares my family's energy consumption with how much my neighbours consume. We are currently doing quite well, outperforming our neighbours, but this was not always the case. When we got our first report, we were in the worst category. This, we decided, was unacceptable. We had our roof insulated and solar panels installed. In addition, we now follow the energy-saving tips provided by O-Power, keep our house warmer in the summer and wear an additional sweater in the winter. The latter steps in particular were simple things, and all the changes we embraced substantially decreased our energy use and helped us save money. In the United States, 70 utility companies have implemented O-Power programs, and more than 8 million households are in their experimental populations. This has made O-Power one of my favourite examples of a successful design when giving a talk about the power of norms. Invariably, someone in the audience has been subject to this intervention. In fact, my family and many others have truly been subjects. O-Power has conducted a number of field experiments using both treatment and control groups. On average, their interventions have significant short-term and long-term effects, decreasing energy use even after households have received the mailing, and leading to a lower level of consumption after the program has been discontinued. But as almost always occurs when researching behavioural insights, O-Power's interventions do not work equally well with all subjects or all the time. Some studies have found that O-Power intervention can lead to backlash among households holding more conservative views, causing these homes to increase their energy consumption. Others report a boomerang effect, where people increase their usage after learning that they were consuming less than average. This reminds me of the moral licensing effect we discussed in Chapter 2, where people who have, or just believe they have, done something good feel licensed to do something bad. I have watched this unfold in my own house. Since joining the ranks of better than average energy users in our neighbourhood, my husband has gotten into the habit of reminding the rest of us, who are not so great at turning off lights, that we should not feel licensed to misbehave only because we decreased our use of air conditioning. Accepting the caveats of backlash and moral licensing, O-Power's intervention is cheap and effective. It stands atop a wealth of research. By making the appropriate comparisons, we can focus people's attention on specific aspects of a problem. Imagine you are a development officer wishing to increase donations to your charity. You must design a flyer or email blast to past contributors. What do you draw the recipient's attention to? You would likely focus on what people have contributed in the past, maybe creating tiers, as many organisations do, that indicate whether people have given at the gold, silver or bronze level. Certainly, you would not rank people in terms of how much they kept for themselves or how much they still have left over after donating. A simple laboratory experiment confirmed this. Participants were placed in a dictator game where individuals were given a certain amount of money that they were to divide as they wished between themselves and an anonymous person. Researchers found that people gave substantially more in a generosity tournament, where they were ranked publicly from most to least generous, as compared to an earnings tournament where they were ranked based on how much they had kept for themselves. In brief, social comparisons matter on almost anything that we can measure, but we have to focus people's attention on the outcome that we care about. Exploring this further, Richard Zeckhauser and I became interested in whether people also take fairness clues from each other. We ran a modified version of the ultimatum game introduced in Chapter 11. It turns the dictator game described above into a bargaining game, where the proposer can offer the receiver a sum of money which she can accept or reject. If she rejects it, however, all the money is lost, including the amount that the proposer was hoping to keep for himself. If the receiver accepts, the deal stays as proposed. When Richard and I told all participants that we would inform the receivers of the average amount given by the proposers before they had to make their accept-reject decision, proposers converged on a norm. In our case, this was an equal split. Proposers feared that receivers would punish deviations from what others did, and they were right. Making public and visible how well a company or country does in terms of gender equality compared to others might also promote convergence on a new norm. Indeed, a number of organisations now provide social comparisons or explicit rankings based on gender equality. In 2006, the World Economic Forum launched its annual Global Gender Gap Report, measuring the existing gender gaps in 4 categories: economic participation and opportunity, pay, participation and leadership, political empowerment, representation, education, access, and health and survival, life expectancy, and sex ratio at birth. Since then, the WEF have annually published a report measuring how the gaps are changing over time. It ranks countries on their overall performance as well as on how well they do in all 4 categories. Over 9 years, the Nordic countries have been leading the pack, with Iceland having closed the overall gap by 87.3%, with 100% indicating gender equality as of 2013. Generally, Middle Eastern and North African countries have fared worst, with Yemen having closed only 51.2% of the overall gap. Sadia Zahidi of the WEF and the lead author of the report explains, "The notion that gender equality is not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing is a fairly new mindset that did not exist in the public consciousness even 5 years ago." Klaus Schwab, the founder and chairman of the WEF, adds, "Achieving gender equality is obviously necessary for economic reasons. Only those economies who have full access to all their talent will remain competitive and will prosper. But even more important, gender equality is a matter of justice. As a humanity, we also have the obligation to ensure a balanced set of values." Related country reports and rankings, each with a slightly different focus and methodology, have since been created by the World Bank, the United Nations Development Programme, the OECD, and the European Institute for Gender Equality, among others. While what facets of gender equality they measure and track differ, some focus on gaps between men and women, for example, in economic opportunity, and others look at absolute rates, for example, in terms of workforce participation. Some cover outcomes, such as compensation, and others measure input variables, such as laws. Some include measures of violence, and others of access to finance. They all generally come to similar conclusions. Gender equality is quite advanced in the Scandinavian countries, while the nations of the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa have the longest way to go. In 2009, the World Bank started collecting data on women, business, and the law, which analyses the legal differentiations on the basis of gender in 143 economies around the world. The report covers 6 areas in relation to gender: accessing institutions, using property, getting a job, providing incentives to work, building credit, and going to court. Based on the 2014 report, a 7th area, protecting women from violence, has recently been added for 100 economies. In 2009, the OECD's Development Center published its first Social Institutions and Gender Index, which provides a composite index of gender inequality. The measure uses 5 sub-indices to calculate this score: discriminatory family code, restricted physical integrity, sun bias, restricted resources and assets, and restricted civil liberties. In 2010, the UNDP launched its Gender Inequality Index, which is a composite measure that calculates differences in the distribution of achievements between women and men across countries. The measure uses 3 dimensions to calculate this score. 1. Reproductive health, measured by maternal mortality ratio and adolescent birth rates. 2. Empowerment, measured by proportion of parliamentary seats occupied by females and proportion of adult females and males aged 25 years and older with at least some secondary education. And 3. Labour market participation rates. In 2013, the European Institute for Gender Equality launched its Gender Equality Index report, where it documents the position of the European Union in terms of gender equality. It ranks EU countries based on their gender gaps in several subcategories including work, money, knowledge, time, health, power, violence, and other intersecting inequalities. Judith Kelly of Duke and Beth Simons of Harvard argue that rankings have become an effective instrument of soft power in international governance, including on some of the biggest challenges of our time, such as human trafficking. Countries which have been included in the annual US Trafficking in Persons report or have been placed on the watch list are more likely to criminalise trafficking. Corporations have also been found to respond to ratings, for example, with respect to their impact on the environment. Researchers evaluated how several hundred firms reacted to the ratings issued by a well-known social rating agency. The poorly performing companies improved their performance after the ratings became public, while companies that were never rated or did better in the initial evaluation did not change. Mike Luca of Harvard Business School and his collaborators demonstrated the impact of rankings on students' application decisions. Improvements in a college's rank on US News and World Report Best College Rankings immediately translate into a larger number of applications. Interestingly enough, however, the authors only find this effect when the magazines present the colleges ordered by rank. When the colleges are listed alphabetically with their rank included in the body copy describing the institution, no effect on applications could be detected. Only easily understandable and highly visible comparisons mattered, something gender equality designers hoping to influence behaviour need to keep in mind. A final but important consideration is this: precisely because people and organisations care about their relative standing, rankings may motivate attempts at manipulation. Ben Eidelman and Ian Larkin, for example, show that when people fall behind, they may engage in deception to boost their rank. Laws and regulations can work in a similar fashion. Just as learning about what others do can make us want to follow the herd or even outperform it, learning what is approved or sanctioned, either formally by law or informally by social norms, also provides information on what acceptable behaviour is. The law, thus, often goes beyond deterrence. It also has an expressive function. Even if the expected cost of violating the law is too small to actually deter, people may take a law as a signal for what the social norm regarding a certain behaviour is. Take jaywalking. Growing up in Switzerland, where people only cross the street when the light tells them to, I used not to jaywalk. Then I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and watched in disbelief how most everyone, but the tourists, crossed the streets in Harvard Square with complete disregard for the colours on the traffic lights. Eventually, I started doing the same, although to this day, I always check whether there are any children about and, if I am walking with someone, wait to see what he or she is doing. Clearly, jaywalking norms in Switzerland and in Cambridge are very different. I doubt that the likelihood of being fined or the size of the fine dramatically differ, so the difference in behaviour lies elsewhere. Economists would say the two places have settled on two different equilibria, a jaywalking and a non-jaywalking one. Without an intervention, it is unlikely that the norms in either place would change. A habitual jaywalker might be incredulous. No intervention is going to disrupt so ingrained a habit, one that verges for some on a perceived right. Odds are, however, that jaywalker isn't also a smoker. In the United States, smoking in public was quite common until relatively recently, but then legislation translated an emerging shift in the public's views into something concrete. Non-smokers who wanted others to refrain from smoking, particularly anywhere near them, now had the moral authority to do so. Social norms were changing from a smoking to a non-smoking equilibrium, constantly being reinforced by people's increasing willingness to sanction deviations. Similar arguments may apply to large differences across locations in compliance with laws and regulations governing speeding, shoplifting, unethical behaviour in organisations, or riding public transportation without paying. Laws and regulations activate informal systems of control. They change how we interpret actions. For example, the National Hockey League's requirements that players wear helmets completely reframed the discussion as to what was proper, acceptable, and to be encouraged. Wearing a helmet, which had been considered a sign of weakness or even unmanliness, now became the norm. Title IX, one of the landmark laws in the United States, offers another example of the power of regulation to set new norms with far-reaching consequences. Signed into law on June 23, 1972 by President Richard Nixon, Title IX prohibits gender discrimination in any federally funded education program or activity. It is best known for opening doors for girls and women who wish to compete in sports, but it has 9 other provisions that influence norms well outside of sports, including protecting students from sexual harassment, providing equal access to higher education, math and the sciences, and fair treatment for pregnant and parenting students. Specifically, the law mandates no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Before it passed, fewer than 300,000 girls had access to high school sports in the United States. Today, it is estimated that more than 3 million girls participate. Given the central role athletics plays in American educational culture, this is a massive shift. Interestingly, the law's advocates had an inkling of what was to come and deliberately kept it quiet. Celebrating the 40th anniversary of the law in 2012, a documentary, Sporting Chance, tells how Title IX came to be. Bernice Sandler, an American women's rights activist who worked with Edith Green, Congresswoman from Oregon, and Birch Bayh, Senator from Indiana, 2 of its key proponents, recalls in the film how Green wanted to avoid drawing too much attention to the law, as she feared that if people understood its potential to promote social change, they might oppose it. I don't want you to lobby, because if you lobby, people will ask questions about this bill and they will find out what it would really do. Sandler continues, and she was absolutely right. It was quite a big break that no one was watching. The impact of Title IX only became apparent a few years after it passed, when it started to trigger proposed amendments, including an attempt to exempt money-making sports from Title IX, various Supreme Court cases, and a host of political actions. Condoleezza Rice, former US Secretary of State, recalled how Title IX overturned social norms in her former hometown of Birmingham, Alabama, then the most segregated big city in the United States. She spoke about the tremendous explosion of opportunity for young women on the playing field, and off it. So I very often think of Title IX as trying to do away with discrimination, but really being about giving opportunity. Many rules serve expressive functions that often go unexamined. They can informally sanction and reward behaviour, which in turn can prove a liability. Take the example of Lee Iacocca, president of the Ford Motor Company from 1970 to 1978, the year he was fired. Iacocca has been described as the driving force behind the Ford Pinto. In 1977, allegations were raised that the Pinto's structural design was compromised, creating a fire hazard. In 1978, 1.5 million of the subcompacts were recalled to install fuel tank protection. In the Ford Pinto case, their case study on applied ethics taught in many business schools, Douglas Birch and John Fielder report that safety concerns were not the norm at Ford. Iacocca was fond of saying, "Safety doesn't sell." Coming from the top, that sent a strong message about company values and what is rewarded and what's sanctioned, formally and informally. What companies live and breathe matters, likely more than any written corporate codes of conduct. Norm entrepreneurs in organizations and in public policy promote behaviors by harnessing people's desire to imitate, compete, and gain social approval. Perhaps the most encouraging testimonial to the powers of norm entrepreneurship is the UK government. Its success at more than doubling the share of female board members without relying on quotas should be a clarion call to others. Designing gender equality, become a norm entrepreneur. Make others' successes increasing gender diversity salient. Use rankings to motivate people to compete on gender equality. Use rules, laws, and codes of conduct to express norms. If you're still with me after that, thank you so much. That was a particularly long one today. It was very interesting because I started thinking about the kinds of media that people are quite often ensconced in. And rather than, kind of derogatorily referring to it as, propagandizing. I think it's more about those kind of social norms that it creates and the expectations of what everybody else is doing. So it was really interesting, this one. If you've got any thoughts or comments, leave them down below and we can have a bit of a conversation. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.